The information provided in this video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. It should not be used to diagnose or treat any health problems or diseases. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional before making any decisions about your health, diet, or starting a new treatment plan. The creators of this presentation are not responsible for any actions or decisions you make based on its content. Before Ozempic, there were tapeworms. Before Wegovy, there was industrial-grade poison sold in a bottle. And before the multi-billion-dollar weight loss industry we know today, there were desperate people willing to risk blindness, heart failure, and even death for the promise of a slimmer waistline. You've seen the headlines. You've heard the chatter. A new class of drugs is completely rewriting the rules on weight loss in America. But this isn't a new story. It's just the latest chapter in a wild, forgotten, and often terrifying 100-year war against fat. A war fought with amphetamines, chemicals, and outright quackery. And understanding this history is the single most important thing you can do to understand the revolution happening right now. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the origin story of the pill in your medicine cabinet. It's the context for the debate raging in your newsfeed. We are going to peel back the curtain on the entire incredible, unbelievable saga of weight loss medication in the United States. From the snake oil salesman of the Gilded Age to the rainbow pills that fueled the 60s. From the catastrophic failure of Fen-Phen in the 90s that left a trail of broken hearts, literally, to the scientific breakthrough that led us to the injections changing millions of lives and bodies today. By the end of this journey, you won't just know the names of the drugs. You'll understand the hope, the hype, and the hidden dangers that have always been part of America's desperate search for a miracle cure. Our story begins just over a century ago. At the turn of the 20th century, America was changing at lightning speed. Cities were exploding, factories were churning, and for the first time a new kind of consumer culture was born. Mass-produced food became available, richer and more plentiful than ever before. At the exact same time, a new ideal of beauty began to emerge, thanks to photography and the first silent films. The Victorian-era celebration of a fuller, more robust figure was fading, replaced by a new slender silhouette. The Gibson girl, with her impossibly corseted, S-shaped figure, became the national ideal. Suddenly, for the first time in history, millions of Americans, particularly women, were caught in a trap. They were surrounded by more calories than ever before, while being pressured by a culture that demanded they be thin. Sound familiar? Into this perfect storm stepped the entrepreneurs. The hustlers, the patent medicine men who saw a golden opportunity. There was no FDA, no federal regulation to speak of. You could put almost anything in a bottle, slap a fancy label on it, make a wild claim and sell it to the masses. The market for fat reducers exploded. One of the very first popular ingredients was, shockingly, thyroid extract. Doctors knew that an overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism, caused people to lose weight rapidly. So, the logic was simple: if deeply flawed, why not just give people animal thyroid hormones to speed up their metabolism? Companies began selling desiccated thyroid glands from pigs and cows as over-the-counter obesity cures. And in a way, they worked. People's metabolisms did rev up. They lost weight. They also developed heart palpitations, tremors, extreme anxiety, and in some cases suffered total cardiac failure. They were essentially giving themselves a dangerous, life-threatening disease to lose a few pounds. But the promise was too powerful to ignore. But even ground-up animal glands seemed tame compared to the most infamous weight loss legend of the era, the tapeworm diet. The idea was as simple as it was horrifying. You swallow a pill containing a tapeworm egg. The parasite hatches and lives in your intestines, consuming a portion of the food you eat, allowing you to lose weight without dieting. Once you reached your goal weight, you take an anti-parasitic pill to kill it. Ads from the time are stomach-churning, often featuring pictures of gaunt, skeletal women, promising you can eat, and always stay thin. Now, historians debate how widespread this practice actually was. It's hard to find concrete proof that these pills even contain real tapeworm eggs. Many were likely just fraudulent laxatives. But the very fact that it was a believable, marketable idea tells you everything you need to know about the desperation of the time. The concept was so powerful, so viscerally effective as a marketing tool, because it tapped into a core desire that still drives the industry today. The dream of losing weight without any effort at all. This was the Wild West of weight loss, a landscape of baseless claims and dangerous concoctions, where the only thing protecting the consumer was their own skepticism. But people weren't skeptical. They were hopeful. They wanted to believe in a miracle. This unregulated chaos, however, couldn't last forever. The government was beginning to notice the trail of injuries and deaths left by the patent medicine industry. A reckoning was coming, but before the law could catch up, science was about to unleash something far more potent and far more deadly than anything the snake oil salesman could have ever dreamed of. A chemical so effective at burning fat that it was used in the manufacturing of explosives. A pill that promised to literally melt the pounds away by turning the human body into a raging furnace. The chemical was called 2,4-dinitrophenol, DNP for short, and its story doesn't begin in a gleaming laboratory or a doctor's office. It begins in the mud and grime of World War I, inside French munitions factories. Workers, known as canary girls, for the way the chemicals stained their skin a sickly yellow, were handling picric acid, a key component in artillery shells. DNP was an impurity in this process, a fine yellow dust that coated everything. And something strange was happening to these workers. They were sweating profusely, constantly thirsty, and losing weight at an alarming rate, all while eating more than ever before. Some would simply collapse, their bodies overcome by a mysterious, raging fever. The connection wasn't made until after the war, in the hallowed halls of Stanford University. In 1933, a researcher named Maurice Tainter was studying the metabolic effects of various chemicals. When he investigated DNP, he discovered the secret behind the canary girl's mysterious ailment. He found that DNP fundamentally short-circuited the human body's energy production. Think of your cells like tiny power plants. Normally, when you eat food, those power plants burn the fuel and convert it into a neat, usable energy packet called ATP. It's efficient. It's controlled. It powers everything you do, from blinking to breathing. DNP storms into that power plant and smashes the machinery. It uncouples the process. Now, when your cells burn fuel, almost none of it gets converted into useful ATP. Instead, it's all released as pure raw wasted heat. Tainter realized he was staring at the most potent fat-burning agent ever discovered. He had found a way to literally command the body to incinerate its own fat stores for no reason at all. It was the equivalent of taking your car, putting it in neutral, and flooring the gas pedal until the tank is empty. The engine roars, it overheats, it burns through fuel at a terrifying rate, but the car goes nowhere. This was the promise of DNP. You could sit on your couch, eat a cheeseburger, and your body would be revving its engine like you were running a marathon. Within months, Tainter and his colleagues began prescribing DNP as a weight loss drug. It was sold over the counter, in unassuming capsules, by dozens of different companies. And the results were nothing short of miraculous. The testimonials were breathtaking. People were losing 2, 3, sometimes 4 pounds a week without changing a single thing about their lifestyle. The pounds were, as promised, melting away. By 1934, it's estimated that over 100,000 Americans were taking DNP. It was a sensation, a revolution. The holy grail of weight loss had been found, not in a mystical herb, but in an industrial chemical. But the body is a finely tuned instrument, and turning up the thermostat to full blast indefinitely has consequences. The canary girls weren't just losing weight, they were also dying. The human body is not designed to be a runaway furnace. The first reports were easy to dismiss. Headaches, nausea, excessive sweating. Annoying, sure, but a small price to pay for a perfect figure, right? Then came the skin rashes, the strange nerve pains, the shortness of breath. And then the most terrifying side effect of all began to emerge. Cataracts. Young, healthy women in their 20s and 30s, who had taken DNP for just a few months, were going blind. The intense cellular heat was literally cooking the lenses of their eyes, turning them opaque and useless. The American Medical Association began issuing frantic warnings. Case reports flooded in, each more horrifying than the last. A woman in San Francisco, after taking just a few pills, developed a fever that wouldn't break. Her temperature climbed to 105, 106, 110 degrees. Doctors packed her in ice, but it was no use. She had cooked from the inside out. This was the truly demonic nature of DNP. There was no antidote. There was no off switch. Once you took a toxic dose, the chain reaction was set in motion. The metabolic fire would just keep burning hotter and hotter until it consumed you. The margin for error was terrifyingly slim. The dose required for rapid weight loss was only slightly less than the dose that could kill you. And that lethal dose varied wildly from person to person. A pill that caused one person to lose 5 pounds could be a death sentence for the person standing next to them. The public outcry was deafening. The miracle drug was now a public menace. But there was a problem. At the time, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, had very little power. Under the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, the government could only seize products that were mislabeled or adulterated. DNP was exactly what it claimed to be, 2,4-dinitrophenol. It wasn't mislabeled. The manufacturers weren't lying. So the FDA was essentially powerless to stop its sale. They could issue warnings, but they couldn't pull it from the shelves. The DNP crisis became a poster child for the failures of American drug regulation. It was this disaster, along with another involving a toxic elixir, that finally gave Congress the political will to act. In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act into law. For the very first time in American history, this new law required companies to prove that a drug was safe before it could be sold to the public. It was a monumental shift, born from the tragedy of DNP. The FDA finally had teeth. One of its very first acts was to declare DNP extremely dangerous and not fit for human consumption. It was pulled from every pharmacy, every drugstore, every patent medicine shop in the country. The age of the first great chemical diet pill was over. It had lasted just 5 years. But DNP didn't vanish. It became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in medical schools. It retreated to the darkest corners of the market, a forbidden fruit for the most desperate. Bodybuilders willing to risk it all for pre-competition leanness. Individuals who saw the risk of blindness and death as a fair trade for a different body. Even today, you can find it for sale on the internet. A deadly relic from a time when our desire to be thin outpaced our understanding of the fire we were playing with. The DNP disaster left a deep scar on the American psyche. It proved that a pill could radically alter the body's metabolism. The dream was real, but it also proved that the price for that dream could be catastrophic. The search for a magic weight loss pill would continue, but now, it would be shadowed by the memory of the yellow dust that promised a furnace and delivered a funeral pyre. The industry needed something new, something that seemed safer, something that didn't work by turning up the heat, but by tinkering with the most complex and mysterious organ in the human body, the brain. The shift was dramatic. Instead of targeting the body's engine, the new approach was to go straight for the control room. The logic was deceptively simple. If you can convince the brain it isn't hungry, the body will have no choice but to comply. And in the 1930s, a new class of drugs emerged that seemed to do exactly that and so much more. They were called amphetamines. Their story, like so many in this saga, begins with a completely different purpose. Initially marketed in the form of the Benzedrine inhaler, it was sold over the counter as a simple nasal decongestant. People quickly discovered its side effects were far more interesting than its intended use. It didn't just clear your sinuses, it cleared the fog from your mind. It produced a feeling of alertness, of boundless energy, of euphoria. Students used it to cram for exams. Truck drivers used it to stay awake on long hauls. And soldiers during World War II were given amphetamines by the millions to combat fatigue and boost morale. They were called pep pills, the go pills. It was almost inevitable that this get-up-and-go drug would find its way into the world of weight loss. A doctor in 1937 noticed that his patients using the Benzedrine inhaler were losing their appetites. A light bulb went on. Soon, pharmaceutical companies were pressing amphetamine into tablets and marketing it directly for weight control. The appeal was instantaneous and overwhelming. Think about it. The diet drugs of the past, like dinitrophenol, made you feel awful. They made you hot, sweaty, and sick. Dieting itself was a miserable, grinding experience of denial and hunger. But amphetamines made dieting feel good. You weren't just not hungry. You were energetic, you were happy, you were confident. You had the energy to clean the whole house, the focus to finish that big project at work, and the drive to do it all with a smile. It was a miracle. It wasn't just a diet pill. It was a happiness pill that also made you thin. For a generation of American housewives in the 1950s and 60s, these pills became a lifeline. They were mother's little helpers, a way to cope with the pressures of maintaining a perfect home, raising perfect children, and fitting into the perfect dress size. Doctors prescribed them freely, with little understanding of their long-term consequences. The pills promised control over appetite, over weight, over mood. But the control was an illusion. The user wasn't in control. The drug was. Because amphetamine is, to put it bluntly, speed. And what goes up must come crashing down. The euphoria would fade, replaced by a crushing wave of depression, irritability, and exhaustion. The only way to feel good again was to take another pill. The dose that once worked was no longer enough. Tolerance built quickly, and with it, dependence. The side effects became more severe. Insomnia, anxiety, paranoia. Users would stay awake for days, their minds racing, sometimes leading to full-blown psychosis, convinced that bugs were crawling under their skin or that government agents were watching them from across the street. The heart, forced to race day in and day out, would become strained, leading to palpitations, high blood pressure, and in some cases sudden death. The miracle cure was revealing its dark side. But instead of pulling back, a subset of the medical community doubled down, creating a practice that now seems like something out of a horror film. This was the era of the fat doctors and their infamous rainbow pills. These weren't just prescriptions for a single type of amphetamine. These doctors operated what were essentially pill mills, prescribing bizarre and dangerous cocktails of drugs to their desperate, weight-conscious patients. The pills were color-coded, giving them their rainbow nickname. A patient might be instructed to take a green and white pill in the morning, a yellow one at noon, a red one in the afternoon, and a black one before bed. Each color was a different drug, a different chemical sledgehammer aimed at the body's systems. The morning pill was a powerful amphetamine to kill appetite and provide a jolt of energy. But that jolt often came with jitters and a racing heart. So another pill, a barbiturate or a tranquilizer, a downer, would be added to take the edge off. The patient was being hit with an upper and a downer at the same time. To speed up water weight loss, powerful diuretics were thrown into the mix, flushing out essential minerals and putting immense strain on the kidneys. And for good measure, they'd often add thyroid hormones, the very same type of drug that had proven so dangerous decades earlier, to try and chemically rev up the metabolism. It was a chemical war being waged inside the patient's body. The uppers fought the downers. The stimulants fought the sedatives. The heart was being told to speed up and slow down simultaneously. It was profoundly reckless, a game of pharmacological roulette. And for a while it was a booming business. Women would travel for hours to see these fat doctors, waiting in long lines for their monthly supply of color-coded pills. They were losing weight, yes, but at a staggering cost to their physical and mental health. Stories began to leak out. Stories of addiction, of psychotic breaks, of young mothers suffering fatal heart attacks. Investigative journalists and congressional committees started to take notice. One of the most famous cases involved President John F. Kennedy, who was being treated by a physician nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, a man notorious for his vitamin shots that were actually cocktails of amphetamines and other substances. The high-stakes world of politics and the quiet desperation of suburban homes were both being fueled by the same dangerous secret. The public outcry grew louder. The image of the friendly family doctor handing out harmless pet pills was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of addiction and abuse. The government was finally forced to act. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, a landmark piece of legislation that sought to regulate mind-altering drugs. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule II, a category reserved for drugs with a high potential for abuse, alongside substances like cocaine and morphine. The freewheeling days of Mother's Little Helpers and rainbow pills were over. Prescriptions became tightly controlled. The fat doctors were shut down. The amphetamine era of weight loss had come to a crashing, ignominious end. The industry had flown too close to the sun, and its wings had melted. But the core idea, the tantalizing promise of a pill that could switch off hunger in the brain, was too powerful to abandon. The crackdown on amphetamines didn't kill the dream. It just sent researchers back to the drawing board. They needed something new. Something that offered the same appetite suppression but without the speed, the addiction, the psychosis. They needed a smarter, more targeted weapon. They began searching for a chemical key that could fit the lock of hunger without unlocking all the other dangerous doors in the brain. And in the years that followed, they believed they had finally found it. They had found two keys, in fact. Two chemicals that, when combined, would unleash the next blockbuster. A drug combination that would eclipse everything that came before it, and eventually, become one of the most notorious and tragic chapters in the entire history of weight loss. The first chemical was called Fen-Phen. It worked by increasing the levels of serotonin in the brain, the same neurotransmitter associated with mood and well-being. But in this context, serotonin had another powerful effect. It created a profound sense of satiety, of being full. It tricked the brain into believing it didn't need any more food. The second chemical was an old acquaintance, a familiar face from the diet pill sagas of the past, phentermine. A close cousin to amphetamine, it was a classic stimulant. It suppressed appetite through a different pathway and gave users a jolt of energy. On their own, each drug was moderately effective, but they both had significant downsides. Fenfluramine could cause drowsiness and depression. Phentermine could cause anxiety, palpitations, and the classic stimulant crash. They were two sides of a coin, each with a flaw that limited its appeal. But what if you could combine them? What if one drug's weakness could be cancelled out by the other's strength? This was the revolutionary idea championed by Dr. Michael Weintraub at the University of Rochester. His theory was elegant in its simplicity. The stimulating, energizing effects of phentermine would counteract the drowsy, sedating effects of fenfluramine. The result wouldn't just be two drugs working side by side. It would be a synergistic combination, a chemical cocktail that would attack fat from two angles while smoothing over each other's rough edges. It was, on paper, the perfect weight loss machine. In 1992, Weintraub published a study that lit the fuse on a cultural powder keg. The results were stunning. Patients taking the combination, which the media would soon christen Fen-Phen, lost an average of over 30 pounds in his long-term study, a figure that was unheard of. They kept the weight off and reported minimal side effects. For a public desperate for a solution, this wasn't just a study, it was a prophecy. It was the miracle they had been waiting for. And here's where the story takes a critical turn. Fenfluramine was already FDA approved under the brand name Pondamin. Phentermine was also FDA approved and had been for decades. Because both drugs were already legal to prescribe individually, doctors were free to prescribe them together for weight loss. This practice is known as off-label prescribing, and it's a common and perfectly legal part of medicine. But in the case of Fen-Phen, this legal loophole became a superhighway. There was no need to wait years for the FDA to approve the specific combination. The floodgates were open from day one. The 1990s were the perfect breeding ground for what happened next. The get thin quick culture was at its peak. Talk shows and magazines were filled with dramatic before and after photos. And now there was a pill, or rather two pills, that promised to deliver those results without the struggle of diet and exercise. The news of Fen-Phen spread not like a rumor, but like a revelation. It wasn't just a drug, it was a phenomenon. Weight loss clinics, once fringe operations, popped up in suburban strip malls across the country. They became pill mills, churning out Fen-Phen prescriptions with minimal medical oversight. Doctors, some well-meaning and some just cashing in, began prescribing it to anyone who asked. The demand was a tidal wave. In 1996 alone, American doctors wrote over 18 million prescriptions for Fen-Phen. It became a household name, a punchline in sitcoms, and a whispered secret at dinner parties. For millions of Americans, mostly women, this wasn't about vanity. It was about taking back control of their lives, their health, and their self-esteem. They believed they had found a safe, medically endorsed key to a problem that had plagued them for years. But while the country was celebrating its new miracle cure, a handful of doctors were beginning to notice something strange, something terrifying. The first signs of trouble came not from a massive government study, but from a small clinic. In 1996, a doctor at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota reported a disturbing pattern. A 29-year-old woman who had been taking Fen-Phen for a year showed up with shortness of breath. An examination revealed she had developed a rare and deadly condition, primary pulmonary hypertension, or PPH. This is a disease where the blood pressure in the arteries of the lungs becomes dangerously high, forcing the right side of the heart to work harder and harder until it eventually fails. It was a virtual death sentence. Ordinarily, PPH is incredibly rare, affecting maybe 1 or 2 people per million. But the Mayo Clinic doctors soon found more cases, then more. And every single one of them had a common link. They were all taking Fen-Phen. They published their findings, a small case report of 24 women, in the New England Journal of Medicine in August of 1997. It was a single ominous drumbeat in the distance. Then came the second blow. Doctors began to discover another, even more widespread problem. Patients on Fen-Phen were developing a unique and bizarre form of heart valve damage. The delicate, paper-thin leaflets of their heart valves, the mitral, aortic, and tricuspid valves, were becoming thickened, scarred, and leaky. It was as if a sticky, fibrous coating was growing over them, causing them to retract and no longer close properly. This meant that with every beat, blood would wash backward, forcing the heart to work exponentially harder to pump blood to the rest of the body. This kind of damage was typically seen after a bout of rheumatic fever, or in users of a specific illegal street drug. But here it was, appearing in otherwise healthy, middle-aged women whose only crime was wanting to lose weight. The evidence was now impossible to ignore. The serotonin-boosting effect of Fen-Phen, the very mechanism that made people feel full, was also acting on the serotonin receptors found on the surface of human heart valves. It was promoting abnormal cell growth, slowly and silently destroying the hearts of the very people it was supposed to be helping. The miracle cure was a time bomb. And for millions of people, that bomb was already ticking inside their chests. The FDA, faced with a deluge of reports from cardiologists across the nation, had to act. The party was over. The biggest blockbuster in weight loss history was about to become one of the biggest medical disasters in a generation. The date was September 15, 1997. The FDA, no longer just suggesting caution, issued a formal request for the voluntary withdrawal of both Fen-Phen and dexphenfluramine from the market. American Home Products, the manufacturer, had little choice but to comply. In an instant, the two drugs that made up the fun in Fen-Phen, the drugs responsible for its incredible effectiveness, were gone. Phentermine, the Fen, was allowed to stay. But without its partners, the magic was gone. The combination was dead. The announcement sent a shockwave of pure panic across the country. Imagine you're one of the 6 million Americans who took this drug. You heard the news on TV, or read it in the paper. The pill you took every morning, the one that finally helped you shed the weight you've been fighting for years, the one your doctor assured you was safe, was now being linked to a rare and fatal lung disease and permanent heart damage. Phone lines at doctors' offices were paralyzed. People who felt perfectly fine were suddenly terrified, listening for a strange flutter in their chest, wondering if every shortness of breath was a death sentence. They were told to see their cardiologist to get an echocardiogram and ultrasound of the heart to see if their own valves had been damaged. For tens of thousands, the news that came back was devastating. So what exactly was this miracle drug doing to people's hearts? The science, when it was finally pieced together, was horrifying in its simplicity. The two drugs, Fen-Phen and dexphenfluramine, worked by boosting serotonin in the brain to make you feel full. But the brain isn't the only place with serotonin receptors. They're also on the delicate, paper-thin leaflets of your heart valves. Think of your heart valves as perfect, one-way doors. They open to let blood through, then snap shut with a tight seal to prevent any of it from flowing backward. It's an elegant, flawless system. But when these drugs flooded the body with serotonin, it was like a constant, irritating signal telling the cells on these valve leaflets to grow. And grow they did. They began to thicken, to scar, to become stiff and deformed. The perfect one-way doors no longer closed properly. They became leaky. With every beat, a little bit of blood would squirt backward. This is called valvular regurgitation. First, it might be minor, but over time, the heart has to work harder and harder to compensate for the leak, pumping more blood just to keep up. This extra workload causes the heart to enlarge, to weaken. Eventually, it can lead to congestive heart failure. The damage was permanent. The only fix was open heart surgery to repair or replace the damaged valves with artificial ones. And then there was the other, even deadlier condition, primary pulmonary hypertension, or PPH. This was the rare lung disease that had been flagged in Europe years earlier. Here, the same mechanism was at play, but in the blood vessels of the lungs. The serotonin surge caused the walls of these arteries to thicken, narrowing the passage for blood. The pressure inside skyrocketed. The right side of the heart, which pumps blood to the lungs, was forced to strain against this immense pressure until it too failed. PPH was, and still is, an almost irreversible and fatal condition. The scale of the human toll was staggering. But as the medical crisis unfolded, a second, equally massive storm was gathering on the horizon. This wasn't a medical storm, but a legal one. It would become the largest tsunami of litigation the pharmaceutical industry had ever seen. It started with a few individual lawsuits, but it quickly morphed into a massive class action effort, uniting tens of thousands of victims against a single corporate giant, American Home Products. This wasn't just a case about a drug having unforeseen side effects. The plaintiffs' lawyers were convinced of something far more sinister. They believed the company knew. They believed the company had seen the warning signs for years and had chosen to ignore them, prioritizing billions in profits over the safety of millions of people. The legal battle that followed was nothing short of epic. It was a war fought not in a field, but in courtrooms and deposition rooms across the country. The prize was justice for the victims and for the lawyers, a share of what was shaping up to be the biggest settlement in history. The stakes for American Home Products were even higher. Survival. A loss could bankrupt the company. The process of legal discovery began, a deep dive into the company's private files. Lawyers for the plaintiff started deposing company executives, scientists, and sales reps, grilling them under oath for hours, days, even weeks. They subpoenaed millions of pages of internal documents, emails, memos, marketing materials, and most importantly, the company's own research studies. They were looking for a smoking gun. They were searching for proof that someone inside the company had raised a red flag, only to be silenced or ignored. And they found it. Buried deep within the corporate archives were documents that painted a chilling picture. There were internal memos discussing the early European reports of PPH. There were animal studies from years earlier showing clear evidence of heart valve damage in rats. There were even concerns raised by the company's own scientists that were downplayed or dismissed by executives in the marketing department. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a study the company itself had commissioned. They had paid a doctor to review the echocardiograms of a small group of patients taking their drug. When the results came back showing that a shocking 30% of these patients had developed the specific heart valve abnormalities, the company's reaction was not to warn the public. Instead, according to the plaintiff's lawyers, they tried to discredit their own study. They argued the results were an anomaly, a statistical fluke. They continued to market the drug as safe. For the victims and their families, each new revelation was another twist of the knife. The feeling of being a victim of a tragic accident was replaced by a burning sense of betrayal. This wasn't just bad luck, this was a choice. A choice made in a boardroom, a calculation that weighed their lives against a stock price. The human cost was everywhere. You had women like Mary Lennon, a 30-year-old from Massachusetts. She took Fen-Phen for just 23 days to lose a bit of weight before her wedding. She developed PPH and died just a year later, gasping for breath as her heart and lungs gave out. Her story, and thousands like it, became the face of the tragedy. These weren't just statistics. They were teachers, mothers, and daughters whose trust in the medical system had been shattered. The legal pressure on American home products became unbearable. The evidence was mounting, and the public relations nightmare was spiraling out of control. The company was facing over 18,000 individual lawsuits. The prospect of fighting each one in front of a jury, of having stories like Mary Lennon's told over and over in open court, was a terrifying one. They had to find a way to stop the bleeding. They decided to attempt a global settlement, a single massive deal that would resolve all current and future claims. In late 1999, they announced a staggering offer, $3.75 billion. It was, at the time, one of the largest civil litigation settlements in U.S. history. The deal was complex, creating a trust fund to compensate victims based on the severity of their injuries. Those with minor valve leakage might receive a few $1,000s for medical monitoring. Those who required surgery could receive over $1 million. It was an attempt to close the darkest chapter in the company's history. But for many it wasn't enough. A core group of lawyers and their clients rejected the settlement. They believed the company was getting off easy. They had uncovered evidence that suggested the cover-up was even deeper than anyone imagined. And they were convinced that the true story of what happened inside American home products had not yet been told. They walked away from the massive settlement to take their chances in court, betting everything on a single high-stakes trial. They were armed with the secret weapon, an internal company document so explosive, so damning, they believed it would not only win their case but would expose the entire rotten system to the world. A document that would come to be known simply as the Doomsday Memo. The Doomsday Memo wasn't a confession, typed out in a fit of guilt. It was a warning, a clinical and chilling prophecy written by a man the drug company itself had hired. His name was Dr. John Blundell, a highly respected British psychopharmacologist and a leading expert on serotonin, the very neurotransmitter that Fen-Phen was designed to manipulate. Wyethurst, the maker of Pondamin, had brought him on as a consultant. They wanted his expertise to bolster their drug's credibility. What they got instead was a fire alarm. In 1994, 2 years before Fen-Phen would hit its absolute peak, Dr. Blundell submitted a report to the company. In it, he laid out a terrifyingly plausible theory. He explained that the drug worked by flooding the body with serotonin. While this suppressed appetite in the brain, serotonin receptors weren't just in the brain. They were everywhere, including the delicate blood vessels of the lungs. Dr. Blundell hypothesized that this constant, artificial flood of serotonin could be causing the smooth muscle cells in the pulmonary arteries to grow uncontrollably. This proliferation, this abnormal growth, would slowly thicken and narrow the arteries, forcing the right side of the heart to work harder and harder to pump blood through them. until eventually it failed. He was describing with unnerving accuracy the exact mechanism of primary pulmonary hypertension, or PPH, a rare, incurable, and always fatal disease. He explicitly warned Wyeth that the risk was likely linked to the duration of use. The longer someone took their drug, the greater the danger. This was the memo's deadliest payload, because the entire business model of Fen-Phen was shifting from short-term 6-week courses to long-term indefinite use. The company was actively encouraging doctors to prescribe it for years, even a lifetime. Dr. Blundell's report was essentially a scientific blueprint for the disaster that was about to unfold. So what did Wyeth do with this explosive information from their own expert consultant? Did they halt production? Did they launch an urgent investigation? Did they warn the public? They did none of those things. Instead, internal documents later unearthed in court proceedings revealed a stunningly cynical strategy. They didn't treat the PPH risk as a public health crisis. They treated it as a public relations problem. Their primary concern wasn't the patients who might die, but the profits that might be lost. Memos flew back and forth between executives discussing how to manage Dr. Blundell. They debated how to counter his findings, how to spin the data, how to create what they called a body of literature that would muddy the waters and provide a counter-argument to his inconvenient science. They saw the truth not as a guidepost, but as an obstacle to be overcome. While they strategized, millions of prescriptions were being written. The clock was ticking. When the first PPH lawsuits began to trickle in, Wyeth's lawyers fought them tooth and nail, arguing that the link was unproven, a statistical anomaly. They portrayed the victims as tragic, but isolated cases. Then, through the painstaking process of legal discovery, a young lawyer in a small firm got a tip. He heard whispers of an internal report, a consultant's warning that the company had buried. He and his team filed motion after motion, demanding Wyeth turn over all documents related to its research on PPH. For months, the company stonewalled, claiming no such document existed. But the lawyers persisted, and finally, under the threat of severe court sanctions, a box of documents arrived. Buried deep inside was Blundell's 1994 report. It was the smoking gun. In the courtroom, the memo was a bombshell. It proved scienter, a legal term for guilty knowledge. It demonstrated that Wyeth knew. They knew their drug was likely causing a fatal disease, they knew the risk increased with the very long-term use they were promoting, and they chose to do nothing. They chose to hide the warning and keep selling the product. The memo transformed the litigation overnight. It was no longer one grieving family's word against a pharmaceutical giant. It was the company's own expert, their own internal science spelling out the danger in black and white. The Doomsday Memo was photocopied and shared among the growing network of attorneys representing Fen-Phen victims. It became the cornerstone of their cases, the key that unlocked hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements for families whose loved ones had, in essence, suffocated to death because their own lungs had turned against them. For the public, the story of PPH was horrifying. To understand it is to understand a waking nightmare. Imagine trying to breathe, but the passages for air in your body are slowly being squeezed shut. Every breath is a struggle. Walking across a room leaves you gasping. Your skin takes on a bluish tint from lack of oxygen. The pressure builds in your heart until it simply gives out. This was the fate that Wyeth had been warned about, and had chosen to risk on behalf of millions of Americans desperate to lose weight. The Doomsday Memo and the PPH lawsuits seemed like the climax of the Fen-Phen disaster. It was a clear story of corporate greed and negligence with the terrible, but seemingly contained human cost. The number of PPH cases, while tragic, was still relatively small, in the hundreds. It seemed the worst was over. The truth had been exposed. The victims were finding some measure of justice. But it wasn't the climax. It was just the opening act. The real catastrophe was far bigger, far more widespread, and had gone completely unnoticed. The Doomsday Memo had exposed the first monster, but an even larger one was still lurking in the shadows, and it was about to be dragged into the light by a curious cardiologist in Rochester, Minnesota. In early 1997, at the world-renowned Mayo Clinic, Dr. Heidi Connolly began to notice a disturbing pattern. A 29-year-old woman came to her clinic. She had been taking Fen-Phen for several months and was now experiencing shortness of breath and fatigue. Dr. Connolly performed an echocardiogram, an ultrasound of her heart. What she saw made her stop. The woman's heart valves, the tiny, delicate leaflets that control the flow of blood through the heart's chambers, were thick, leaky, and scarred. They looked like the valves of a much older person with rheumatic fever. But this woman was young and had no history of such a disease. A few weeks later, another woman, 36 years old, came in with similar symptoms. She too was on Fen-Phen. Her echocardiogram showed the same bizarre, specific pattern of valve damage. Then another, and another. They were all women, all relatively young, and all taking the same combination of diet drugs. They didn't have PPH. Their lungs were clear. This was something else entirely. This was a silent, insidious attack on the very engine of the body. Dr. Connolly and her colleagues realized they might be seeing something new, a previously unknown side effect. They launched a systematic review, pulling the records of every patient they had seen who was taking Fen-Phen. They found 24 women who all showed the same unique, drug-induced valvular heart disease. The damage was unmistakable and the common denominator was undeniable. In August 1997, the Mayo Clinic published its findings in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. The report landed with the force of an earthquake. The medical community, the media, and the public had been focused on the lungs. They had been looking for PPH. But this new evidence suggested the real danger might be to the heart. And unlike PPH, which was exceedingly rare, heart valve damage could be a far more common complication. The number of potential victims wasn't in the hundreds anymore. With 6 million Americans taking Fen-Phen, the number of people with potentially damaged hearts could be in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. The scope of the disaster had just expanded exponentially. The crisis had just begun. The news hit the American public like a physical blow. It wasn't just a vague warning anymore. It was a clear and present danger, confirmed by one of the most respected medical institutions in the world. The story exploded. It was the lead on every nightly newscast, the front page of every major newspaper. The message was terrifyingly simple. The miracle drug that millions were taking to improve their lives could be silently destroying their hearts. And it didn't matter if you'd been on it for a year or just a month. Everyone was at risk. A tidal wave of panic swept across the country. Phone lines at doctors' offices were jammed with frantic patients. Cardiologists suddenly had waiting lists months long, filled with people desperate for an echocardiogram, the ultrasound test that could reveal the deadly damage to their heart valves. Imagine the terror. You took a pill prescribed by your doctor. A pill to lose 20 pounds, to feel better about yourself, to get your health under control. And now you were lying awake at night, listening to your own heartbeat, wondering if it was a ticking time bomb. For the Food and Drug Administration, the time for caution was over. The new Mayo Clinic data was the smoking gun they couldn't ignore. The pressure from the public, from Congress, from the medical community was immense. On September 15, 1997, the FDA acted decisively. They requested that American Home Products, the maker of Fen-Phen and Redux, voluntarily withdraw both drugs from the market. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a demand. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of forced removal, the company had no choice but to comply. On that day, Fen-Phen, the biggest blockbuster in the history of weight loss, was officially dead. The financial fallout for American Home Products was immediate and catastrophic. Their stock price plummeted, wiping out billions of dollars in market value in a single day. The company that had been riding a wave of unprecedented profit was now facing a corporate nightmare of its own making. They had aggressively marketed these drugs, downplayed the early warning signs, and reassured doctors and patients that everything was fine. Now the truth was out and the bill was coming due. It's crucial to clarify here that the Fen in Fen-Phen referred to two drugs, fenfluramine, sold as Fen-Phen, and its chemical cousin dexfenfluramine, sold as Redux. These were the drugs linked to the heart and lung damage. The Fen part of the cocktail, phentermine, was not implicated in the heart valve crisis. While the FDA requested the withdrawal of the Fen drugs, phentermine was allowed to remain on the market, where it still is today. But in the public consciousness, the entire combination was now toxic, a synonym for medical disaster. But this was so much bigger than a corporate crisis. This was a human tragedy unfolding in millions of homes. The damage the drugs caused wasn't just a statistical risk. It was a life-altering medical condition. The primary concern was valvular heart disease. Your heart has 4 valves that act like one-way doors, ensuring blood flows in the right direction. Fen-Phen was causing the leaflets of these valves, particularly the mitral and aortic valves, to thicken and stiffen, almost like scar tissue was forming on them. This meant the valves couldn't close properly. They leaked. When a valve leaks, blood flows backward, a condition called regurgitation. This forces the heart to work much harder to pump the same amount of blood to the rest of the body. In the early stages, a person might not feel anything, but over time, this constant strain can lead to an enlarged heart, shortness of breath, debilitating fatigue, and eventually heart failure. For many, the only solution was open heart surgery to repair or replace the damaged valves, a traumatic, high-risk procedure with a long and painful recovery. And that wasn't the only threat. The earlier danger, the one that had been known for years but largely ignored, was still there: primary pulmonary hypertension, or PPH. This is a rare but almost universally fatal condition where the blood pressure in the arteries of the lungs becomes dangerously high. It suffocates the heart, leading to complete cardiac collapse. While valvular heart disease was the new widespread discovery, thousands of former Fen-Phen users now lived with the double terror, wondering if their hearts or their lungs would fail them first. So what do you do when you're one of those 6 million people? First, you stop taking the pills. Then you call your doctor. You get on a waiting list for an echocardiogram. And then you wait. You wait for weeks, maybe months, living in a state of suspended fear. Every flutter in your chest, every time you feel out of breath walking up the stairs, you wonder, is this it? Is this the damage they were talking about? When the results finally come in, it's a moment of truth. For many, thankfully, the test comes back clear. Their relief is overwhelming. But for tens of thousands of others, the news is devastating. The sonogram shows a leaky valve. The doctor explains what it means, using words like moderate regurgitation and long-term monitoring. They are told they now have a pre-existing condition. They will need to see a cardiologist for the rest of their lives. They may need major surgery down the road. Their life has been irrevocably changed by a diet pill. As these diagnoses piled up, a new kind of storm was gathering. It wasn't a medical storm but a legal one. Across the country, trial lawyers saw what was happening. They saw a giant corporation that had sold a dangerous product. They saw millions of potential victims. And they saw the makings of the largest medical class action lawsuit in the history of the United States. Suddenly, the airwaves and newspapers were filled with a new kind of advertisement. They all started with the same question: did you or a loved one take Fen-Phen or Redux? Law firms began setting up screening centers in hotel ballrooms, running echocardiograms for free, looking for potential clients. They were building an army of ordinary people, teachers, office workers, stay-at-home moms, who had all been harmed by the same drug. For American home products, the nightmare was shifting from a PR crisis to a fight for its very survival. The company was now facing a legal onslaught on a scale that was almost unimaginable. They weren't just being sued by a few people. They were facing the collective anger of a nation. The company had two choices: fight thousands upon thousands of individual lawsuits in courtrooms across America for decades to come, a strategy that could bankrupt them through legal fees alone, or try to find a way to settle with everyone at once. The stage was set for a legal showdown of epic proportions. On one side, a pharmaceutical behemoth with billions of dollars and an army of corporate lawyers. On the other, a coalition of plaintiffs' attorneys representing a vast and growing number of injured clients. The question was no longer just about medicine or regulation. It was about liability. It was about justice. And it was about money. A lot of money. The battle for compensation, a battle that would define the legacy of Fen-Phen and change the face of pharmaceutical litigation forever, was about to begin. The first lawsuit was a tremor. Then came the aftershocks. Within weeks, it was an earthquake. A legal tsunami the likes of which the pharmaceutical industry had never seen. The recall of Fen-Phen didn't close a chapter. It ripped the book wide open. Suddenly, law firms across the country were running full-page newspaper ads and late-night television commercials. The message was simple, direct, and terrifying. Have you or a loved one taken Fen-Phen? You may be entitled to substantial compensation. This wasn't just a call to action, it was a call to arms. And people answered. By the thousands, then the tens of thousands. The phone lines at law offices were jammed. Mailrooms overflowed. The scale was staggering. An estimated 6 million Americans had taken the drug combination. Now a significant portion of them were terrified, wondering if the pills they took to slim down for a wedding or a beach vacation had planted a time bomb in their chests. At the center of this storm was American Home Products, the parent company of Wyeth Ayers Laboratories, the maker of Fen-Phen. Their initial strategy was what you might expect from a corporate behemoth facing an existential threat: deny, delay, and defend. They argued that the link between their drug and PPH or heart valve damage was not definitively proven. They pointed to the relatively small number of confirmed cases compared to the millions who took the drug without apparent issue. They prepared to fight each case one by one, in courtrooms across the nation, hoping to bleed the plaintiffs dry with legal fees and endless procedural hurdles. It was a classic playbook designed to wear down the opposition, to make the cost of seeking justice too high for the average person. But this wasn't the average case. And these weren't average lawyers. A new breed of plaintiff's attorney, specialists in what's known as mass tort litigation, saw the Fen-Phen crisis for what it was: the single largest pharmaceutical liability case in history. They weren't just taking on individual clients, they were building armies. They pooled resources, shared evidence, and developed a coordinated national strategy. They set up mobile echocardiogram clinics in hotel ballrooms and community centers, screening thousands of former Fen-Phen users for a fee, actively searching for the heart valve damage that would be their golden ticket into the litigation. It was a controversial, assembly line approach to justice, but it was brutally effective. They were turning a scattered group of individual victims into a unified, powerful legal force. And the stories they uncovered were heartbreaking. They found people like Mary Lennon, a 29-year-old woman from Massachusetts who, after taking Fen-Phen for just 23 days to lose a little weight, developed PPH so severe she died while waiting for a lung transplant. Her family's lawsuit became one of the first high-profile cases to go to trial. There were stories of young mothers, now too breathless to chase their children across the lawn. Stories of active, healthy people in their 30s and 40s, suddenly facing the prospect of open-heart surgery to replace valves that were supposed to last a lifetime. These weren't abstract statistics. They were lives, shattered by a desire to lose a few pounds and a trust in a pill their doctor prescribed. The lawyers for these victims dug deep. Through the legal process of discovery, they demanded access to American Home Products' internal files, memos, and research data. And in those millions of pages of documents they found it. The smoking gun. Or rather, a whole arsenal of them. They unearthed memos from as early as the 1980s showing that the company was aware of a potential link between its drug and heart problems. They found evidence that the company had received numerous reports of valvular heart disease long before the Mayo Clinic study was ever published, but had allegedly failed to properly investigate or report them to the FDA. One of the most damning revelations was the story of an Italian study from 1994. The company had sponsored this study, which found a clear, alarming link between fenfluramine and PPH. But instead of publishing the results or warning the public, the company allegedly fought with the researchers, tried to suppress the findings, and continued to market the drug as safe. To a jury, this wasn't just negligence. It looked like a cover-up. It looked like a conscious decision to place profits ahead of patient safety. With this evidence in hand, the plaintiffs' lawyers had American Home Products cornered. The company was losing early trials, with juries awarding massive, multi-million-dollar verdicts to individual plaintiffs. The case of Mary Lennon settled out of court for a confidential, but reportedly enormous sum. The company's stock price was plummeting. The cost of fighting tens of thousands of individual lawsuits, each one a potential public relations disaster and a financial black hole, was becoming unsustainable. The wall of denial was crumbling. They had to find a way out. That way out came in late 1999, in the form of one of the largest legal settlements in American history. American Home Products agreed to a national settlement, setting aside a staggering $3.75 billion to compensate victims. It was a mind-boggling figure, a public admission of massive liability. But the settlement wasn't a simple blank check. It was an incredibly complex legal structure. A trust fund designed to operate for years, even decades, created a tiered system. People who had taken the drug, but had no signs of injury could receive a refund for the cost of the pills and medical monitoring. Those with minor asymptomatic valve damage could receive a set amount, ranging from a few thousand to several $100,000. But for those with the most severe injuries, those who had developed PPH or required heart valve replacement surgery, the potential payouts were much larger, reaching into the millions. The settlement provided a matrix, a formula to calculate compensation based on the severity of the injury, the age of the victim, and other factors. It was an attempt to bring order to the chaos, to create a predictable system for resolving over 100,000 claims without clogging the courts for the next 50 years. But this colossal settlement was itself a battleground. It created a deep rift within the plaintiffs' legal community. Some lawyers urged their clients to accept the deal, arguing it was the fastest, most certain path to compensation. Others railed against it, claiming it was a sellout, A lowball offer that let the company off easy and wouldn't adequately compensate the sickest victims for a lifetime of medical care and suffering. They encouraged their clients to opt out of the national settlement and pursue their own individual lawsuits, gambling on a bigger payout from a sympathetic jury. The fight over the settlement revealed the messy, often brutal, reality of mass litigation. It was a world of high-stakes negotiation, where lawyers who stood to make hundreds of millions of dollars in fees were advising clients on life-altering decisions. The legacy of Fen-Phen would not just be the medical tragedy it caused, but the legal machine that rose up in its wake. It created a new playbook for suing Big Pharma, a model of mass advertising, mass screenings, and massive consolidated settlements that would be replicated again and again. The battle for compensation had been won, at least on paper. But the true cost, both for the victims and for the public's trust in the systems meant to protect them, was still being calculated. The Fen-Phen crisis carved a deep scar into the American psyche. For the first time, a lifestyle drug, one taken by millions of healthy people to improve their lives, had been exposed as a potential killer on a massive scale. The FDA, the institution designed to be the impenetrable wall between the public and dangerous medicine, had been breached. Its reputation was in tatters. Pharmaceutical companies, once seen as innovators, were now viewed with a deep corrosive suspicion. And doctors, the trusted gatekeepers of health, were now facing malpractice suits and a crisis of confidence. The entire ecosystem of American healthcare was reeling. In the wake of this implosion, a vacuum formed. The demand for a weight loss solution hadn't vanished. If anything, it intensified as obesity rates continued to climb. But the supply of credible, prescription-strength options had evaporated. The market was a minefield, and no one wanted to take the next step. Into this void, however, a new contender was already waiting in the wings. It had been approved by the FDA in late 1997, at the very peak of the Fen-Phen panic. Its name was sibutramine, but it would become known to millions by its brand name, Meridia. The marketing genius of Meridia was that it was positioned as everything Fen-Phen was not. It wasn't a cocktail of two separate drugs. It wasn't a souped-up amphetamine. Its mechanism was more subtle, more medical. Meridia worked by inhibiting the reuptake of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine in the brain. In simple terms, it made you feel fuller faster. It was a satiety drug, not a speed drug. The sales pitch was elegant and reassuring. This wasn't about artificially boosting your energy to burn calories. This was about restoring your body's natural signals of fullness, giving you the control you'd lost. It was the smart drug, the modern solution. For a public terrified of heart valve damage and a medical community desperate for a safer alternative, Meridia seemed like the answer. But from the very beginning, there were whispers of concern. The initial FDA approval itself was contentious. During the advisory panel meetings, some experts pointed to a troubling side effect seen in the clinical trials. Meridia consistently caused a small but significant increase in both blood pressure and heart rate. For a medication intended for an overweight and obese population, a group already at high risk for cardiovascular problems, this was a glaring red flag. The vote to approve it was narrow. The FDA ultimately gave it the green light, but with a stern warning label. It was not to be used by patients with a history of coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, arrhythmias, or stroke. The problem, of course, was that in the real world of busy clinics and desperate patients, these warnings are often overlooked. Unlike the explosive, fast-moving catastrophe of Fen-Phen, the story of Meridia was a slow-burn tragedy that unfolded over more than a decade. The drug hit the market and was an immediate success, prescribed to millions of people. But almost immediately, consumer advocacy groups, particularly Public Citizen, founded by Ralph Nader and led by Dr. Sidney Wolfe, began sounding the alarm. They pointed to the pre-approval data and argued that any drug that raised blood pressure in a population at risk for heart attacks was fundamentally unsafe, especially when its benefits, an average weight loss of just 5 to 10%, were modest. They began petitioning the FDA to ban the drug as early as 2002, citing a growing number of adverse event reports, including dozens of deaths linked to cardiovascular events in Meridia users. For years, the FDA and the drug's manufacturer, Abbott Laboratories, pushed back. They argued that the benefits outweighed the risks for the right patients, that the drug was safe when used as directed, and that the adverse event reports didn't prove causation. But the pressure, both public and political, continued to mount. The ghost of Fen-Phen haunted every discussion. The FDA knew it couldn't afford another massive public health failure. So, it did something that would become a hallmark of post-Fen-Phen regulation. It demanded a massive long-term post-market clinical trial. The study was called the Sibutramine Cardiovascular Outcomes Trial, or SCOUT. It was a colossal undertaking. The trial enrolled nearly 10,000 overweight and obese patients, all of whom were over 55 and had pre-existing cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes. The goal was to finally prove, once and for all, that Meridia was safe for this high-risk population. The study's participants were randomly assigned to receive either Meridia or a placebo, and they were followed for up to 6 years. The entire industry held its breath. Abbott Laboratories had staked the future of its blockbuster drug on the outcome. The FDA had staked its renewed reputation on the integrity of this process. The study was supposed to be Meridia's vindication. Instead, it became its death sentence. In late 2009, the preliminary results began to leak, and they were devastating. The data was unequivocal. The group taking Meridia had a 16% higher risk of experiencing a non-fatal heart attack, non-fatal stroke, resuscitation after cardiac arrest, or death than the group taking a placebo. The very thing the drug was supposed to help prevent in the long run, cardiovascular events linked to obesity, it was actively causing in the short term. And for this catastrophic increase in risk, the patients got almost nothing. The average weight loss in the Meridia group was only slightly better than in the placebo group. The risk-to-benefit calculation wasn't just poor, it was non-existent. The drug was causing tangible harm for a negligible, almost cosmetic benefit. The fallout was immediate and global. In January 2010, the European Medicines Agency, Europe's equivalent of the FDA, reviewed the SCOUT data and recommended that the drug be suspended across the entire European Union. Australia followed suit. Country after country began pulling Meridia from pharmacy shelves. The pressure on the American FDA became unbearable. For months, the agency deliberated, holding public hearings where distraught patients and furious doctors testified. Finally, in October 2010, the hammer fell. The FDA requested that Abbott Laboratories voluntarily withdraw Meridia from the U.S. market. The company complied. After 13 years and millions of prescriptions, another blockbuster weight loss drug was gone. The Meridia saga proved that the lessons of Fen-Phen had been only partially learned. Yes, the regulatory system had worked in a slow, grinding, bureaucratic way. A post-market study had eventually caught the danger and forced the drug off the market. But it had taken 13 years. For 13 years, a drug with known cardiovascular risks was prescribed to millions of people, many of whom were precisely the kind of at-risk patients who should have avoided it. It revealed a persistent systemic vulnerability. The immense commercial and social pressure for a simple pill to treat a complex condition could still lead to dangerous compromises. With the demise of Meridia, the 2000s came to be seen as a lost decade for obesity pharmacotherapy. The two biggest drugs to launch since the 1990s had now gone down in flames, one in a sudden explosion, the other in a slow, smoldering fire. The field was radioactive. Pharmaceutical companies shuttered their weight loss research divisions. Doctors became even more hesitant to prescribe anything, and the public's trust hit an all-time low. The old approach, tinkering with brain chemistry using stimulant-like drugs to suppress appetite, was now seen as a dead end, a path littered with unacceptable risks. The market was once again a barren landscape. But this time the failure was so complete, so profound, that it forced the scientific community to abandon the old map entirely. A fundamentally new path was needed, and the search for it would lead researchers away from the brain and toward a different, overlooked system in the body. The complex world of hormones that governs hunger, digestion, and metabolism. The next revolution wouldn't be about chemistry, it would be about biology. The answer wasn't found in a high-tech lab in Silicon Valley, or a pharmaceutical giant in New Jersey. It was found in the arid deserts of the American Southwest, hiding in the saliva of a venomous, slow-moving lizard, the Gila monster. This creature, with its beaded orange and black skin, holds one of the most important secrets in modern medicine. How? Because of the way it eats. The Gila monster might only have a few massive meals a year. To survive this, its body evolved a remarkable biological toolkit to manage the huge, sudden flood of nutrients. And a scientist working in a VA hospital in the Bronx was the one who figured it out. His name was Dr. John Ung, and in the early 1990s he was studying the vast diversity of hormones across the animal kingdom. He was particularly interested in a class of hormones called incretins. The concept was simple. When you eat, your gut releases these incretin hormones. They travel to the pancreas and act like a foreman on a construction site, yelling, "Hey, food's coming down the pipe." Get the insulin ready. One of the most important of these hormones in humans is called glucagon-like peptide 1, or GLP-1. Scientists knew GLP-1 was a powerful signal for insulin release, but as a potential drug, it had a fatal flaw. The human body destroys it almost instantly. A dose of GLP-1 would be gone from your system in less than 2 minutes. It was completely useless for therapy. But Dr. Ung, sifting through the venom of the Gila monster, found a molecule that looked shockingly similar to human GLP-1. He called it Ozempic, and when he tested it, he discovered its superpower. Unlike the fragile human version, the lizard's Ozempic was a fortress. It was incredibly resistant to the enzymes that break down GLP-1 in the human body. It didn't last for 2 minutes. It could last for hours. This was the Holy Grail, a long-acting version of a natural human hormone that regulated blood sugar. The discovery was licensed, developed, and in 2005, the FDA approved the first-ever drug in this new class. Exenatide, sold under the brand name Byetta. It was approved as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. And that's all it was supposed to be. But then, something remarkable started happening. Patients who started taking Byetta for their diabetes began reporting a stunning side effect. They were losing weight. Not just a few pounds either. They were losing 10, 15, even 20% of their body weight. And it wasn't because they were forcing themselves to diet. They just weren't hungry anymore. The constant, nagging food noise in their heads had gone quiet. The desire to snack between meals vanished. When they did eat, they felt full after only a few bites and stayed full for hours. This wasn't just a diabetes drug. This was something else entirely. Researchers scrambled to figure out what was going on. They realized that GLP-1, and its supercharged lizard venom cousin, did far more than just talk to the pancreas. It was a master regulator of the entire digestive system. First, it hits the brakes on your stomach. It dramatically slows down gastric emptying, meaning the food you eat physically stays in your stomach for much longer. This is the source of that profound, long-lasting feeling of physical fullness. It's not a trick. You literally are full for longer. Second, and perhaps most importantly, it talks directly to your brain. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to receptors in the hypothalamus, the ancient part of our brain that controls our most basic drives, including hunger and satiety. It sends a powerful, unambiguous signal. Energy has been received. We are secure. You can stop seeking food now. This is what silences the food noise. It was a biological off-switch for cravings, a chemical signal of contentment that willpower alone could rarely achieve. For the first time, a medication was working with the body's intricate hormonal signaling system, not against it. It wasn't a stimulant jacking up the central nervous system like an amphetamine. It was an elegant biological message, delivered to the precise receptors that nature designed to control appetite. The success of Byetta, which had to be injected twice a day, kicked off a pharmaceutical arms race. The next evolution was liraglutide, a once-a-day injection approved for diabetes as Victoza. When researchers tested a higher dose specifically for weight loss, it was so effective that the FDA approved it in 2014 under a new name, Saxenda. This was a landmark moment. It was the first time a GLP-1 drug was approved specifically for chronic weight management in people without diabetes. The paradigm had officially shifted, but the real earthquake was yet to come. Scientists at the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk were working on the next generation. Their goal was to modify the GLP-1 molecule to make it even more durable, so durable that it would only need to be injected once a week. They succeeded, creating a molecule called semaglutide. In 2017, it was approved for diabetes under the brand name Ozempic. The clinical trials for diabetes were impressive enough, but the weight loss data was simply staggering. It was so much more powerful than anything that had come before. This led to the STEP trials, a series of studies looking at high-dose semaglutide exclusively for weight loss. The results, published in 2021, electrified the medical world. The average weight loss was around 15% of total body weight. Some participants lost over 20%. These were numbers that had previously only been seen with bariatric surgery. This wasn't just statistically significant, it was life-changing. In June 2021, the FDA approved high-dose semaglutide for weight loss. It was given a new name for this new purpose, Wegovy. And with that, everything changed. The story of weight loss medication in America had come full circle. We began with desperate, dangerous, and unregulated concoctions. We moved to blunt instruments like amphetamines that treated the body like a machine to be revved up. We tried to trick the brain with drugs like Fen-Phen with devastating consequences. And now we have arrived in the age of endocrinology, an age where we can use a synthetic version of a hormone, first discovered in the venom of a desert lizard, to communicate with our bodies in their own native language. This new chapter isn't just about a new class of drugs. It's about a fundamental shift in our understanding of obesity itself. For decades, the narrative was one of personal failure, a lack of willpower, a moral failing. These medications have revealed, in stark, undeniable terms, the profound power of our underlying biology. They show that for many, the constant battle with hunger isn't a character flaw, but a complex hormonal signal that can now, for the first time, be adjusted. The story, of course, is far from over. We are living through the next chapter right now. Questions about cost, access, and long-term use are monumental. We're still learning about side effects and what happens when people stop taking them. New, even more powerful drugs that target multiple hormones are already on the horizon. But one thing is certain: the century-long search for a safe and effective weight loss medication has led us here. From the snake oil of the 19th century to the biological revolution of the 21st, the journey has been long, fraught with danger, and filled with hope. It has forever changed the way we think about weight, and the way we think about medicine itself.